what we were able to do was work with 6 members of the WBCSD. These are 6 architecture and engineering firms, and have them do an embodied carbon analysis on the same Revit model. And what we found is that there was a 34% variation in the results. So even though we all looked at the same project, we made several decisions as a cohort to align, what type of materials and data sets were being used, we still saw 34% variation, which is wild because when you zoom out and think about all of the regulations and industry pressures around embodied carbon tracking, a lot of them are based on benchmarks or relative guidelines around the actual quantity of embodied carbon in a project. But what this means is without guidelines or transparency behind the processes that firms are using, we might not be able to actually compare a project apples to apples to another project because there's a lot of differences along the process, assumptions, interpretations that results in this type of variation.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipp, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Most architects want to design a sustainable building, but the reality is most sustainability tools are expensive, complicated, or come into the process too late to make a real impact. And that's exactly what Sheena Zhang is working to fix. As a sustainability specialist at Autodesk, she helps develop tools like Forma or Insight that make it faster and easier to design greener buildings. Sheena reveals why 6 top architecture firms analyzing the same building came up with embodied carbon results that varied by 34%. She also breaks down how to spot and avoid greenwashing, why AI can be both a game changer and a huge risk for sustainability, and she shares how Autodesk is making sustainability insights available to the whole industry and not just high-budget projects. If you want to know how technology is shaping the future of sustainable buildings, how to make sustainability decisions based on data, and why the way we're measuring carbon today might be misleading, this is an episode you don't want to miss. For the full experience, make sure you turn on your video on Spotify or YouTube, wherever you're watching, because Sheena walks us through a live demo of the tools. Sheena, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm super excited to be speaking with you. Before we start going into all the technical details of your work, could you just start by sharing your story and tell me how you got where you are today?
My role today is as an AECO sustainability specialist at Autodesk. And what that means is I work a lot on sustainability strategy and the technology tools and the strategy surrounding those for Autodesk's architecture, engineering, construction, and operations portfolio, which is quite a wide breadth of different types of industries. So it's really exciting, really fast-paced, and I could definitely talk more about my work there. But the way I got there is probably not a typical path, but I think a lot of people in the green building industry don't have a typical path because it is such an interesting and nuanced field. So I actually started out as an ecology major in undergrad, really always focused around sustainability and systems thinking around the environment and our impact on it. And I also really had an interest in design and architecture, and that led me to do a joint degree, a master's in architecture and a master's in environmental management, where, when I started my career, really didn't even know that this was a field, but, through sort of happenstance seminar class, learned a lot more about the field of urban ecology, and that led me to the field of sustainable design. So after going through my graduate school studies, worked as an architect for several years, got licensed, did the whole IDP hours, exams, all of those components of the architecture profession. And then after that, moved into sustainability consulting. So as a sustainability consultant, worked very closely with architects, engineers, owners to basically be part of the design team and actually implement sustainability strategies and do analysis, make recommendations, and help projects really implement sustainability. And then after several years of doing that, I was really thinking about my role and the sort of limited time we have to meet our climate goals by 2030, and the fact that many projects take many, many years to actually get from design through construction and operations. And just feeling like I wanted to move faster and have my impact go broader at scale. And so that led me to Autodesk, where moving from like a very sort of niche world of sustainability consulting, which is typically only available for really ambitious clients and clients that have the funds to actually hire an external consultant to dive deep on the topic, and moving into a world where maybe only 10% of projects have sustainability consultants, but probably 90+% of projects use Autodesk software. And so how can we actually bring the sustainability tools and technology closer to the design, construction, and operations practitioners so that they are able to have access to these tools and insights, because I think without that information closely tied to the industry, we're going to be really facing a challenge in actually meeting climate goals.
I feel like that's such an important role because as we said before, like architects are just, or their buildings are just as smart or as good as their programming skills in a way. Earlier it was sketching skills, but now we're all just programming, if we can say that. So the easier it is to build sustainably with those tools, the more sustainable our buildings are going to be. So now at Autodesk, you work on these cutting edge sustainability tools like Forma and Insight for Revit, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do these actually help architects and builders make better decisions in real time?
Yeah, so maybe it would be a good time to maybe share a visual of what these tools look like, if that's
Sure,
all right.
cool.
Okay, great. Yeah, I find sometimes it's just helpful to actually see the tools in action. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sustainability tools at Autodesk. Just one disclaimer I have to make is that I might be talking about forward-looking development, and this is based on our current knowledge today, but these plans can change, and so please don't make purchasing decisions of Autodesk stock based on what we talk about today. So the first one I want to dive into is Forma, which I'll play the video. You can see this is a web-based modeling software that is really geared towards conceptual early phase stages of design. You can see like massing level of detail. And what Forma has is a series of sustainability analysis tools within a suite. And one of those tools is embodied carbon. And so what you're seeing here in this demo is individual settings and parameters around the building design. So for example, the envelope makeup, the program type, what type of structure you're using, things like that, that really drive the embodied carbon around the project construction. And it very quickly, you can see it already spat out some results. you can see what the impact of different material choices are and massing choices based on your conceptual level of design. And what you're seeing here is actually Forma allows you to do a side-by-side comparison. So this means you can compare previous decisions to maybe new options and iterations that you're looking at. I also mentioned some of the earlier some of the other sustainability analyses. So that includes solar analysis, PV potential, daylight, microclimate, wind. And when you run an analysis, you can actually compare not just embodied carbon to embodied carbon, but embodied carbon holistically with other sustainability parameters. So we know that sustainability is not a sort of single faceted topic. It's really to implement sustainability in a really integral way, it requires a holistic view of many different parameters, not just embodied carbon, but thinking about comfort, daylight, things like that.
That's so cool. And can other things be tracked there or just embodied carbon?
You can see at the top, there's like these other little icons. So for example, the sun is a solar analysis. And so with that, you can actually see based on your site and location and surrounding context, what the relative sun hours would be of solar exposure on the facade or ground. You can set your analysis parameters as one example. Another one that you can see is the wind icon. And so that actually uses machine learning to predict what the wind patterns would be based on, again, on your site and contextual data. Or you could run a more sort of like real-time wind analysis to see the results of that. And then taking the wind and the solar analysis and the climate data for your location, we surface that in the microclimate analysis. So that's something that, having done this myself as a sustainability consultant, typically takes a very long time, just in terms of hours of computation around geometry and all these inputs. But using Forma, you can actually get those types of insights really quickly. And so knowing that designers are typically budget, schedule, staffing strapped, we think that bringing these types of analyses in a fast and iterative manner to the design process means that we don't have to wait to actually make decisions and waiting for these fully vetted and like put into a very polished report, when really, the thing that's important is what is the impact on the design and what can I do with that information?
Are you saying you would use the tool if you were still in consulting?
Yeah, I definitely think I would. Obviously, I might be a bit biased now, but I know specifically, there are so many things that early on in a project, you don't really have too much information about the project, and a lot of that information is needed for sustainability analysis. Of course, there's always higher level types of analysis that you can do, but Forma brings all of those analyses into a single platform and lets you accomplish it in a very fast way so that you can actually take this to meetings, show clients, and demonstrate, this is the real impact that these types of decisions we're making about square footage, massing, height, etc., materials have.
So would it be correct to say that the process would look something like you do in your own way, whatever your usual design process looks like? You sketch and develop a first concept, and then you export the project and import it into Forma. You get like a broad analysis. And once decisions are made, or to end up with only decision between 2 or 3 concepts instead of 20, you then go to an expert and have like a deeper analysis done.
Yeah, it could look like that for sure. I think there's definitely workflows where someone might use Forma to, like you said, narrow down design options and understand what those mean. And, to be honest, a lot of times those experts aren't brought on to the project until later phases anyway, partially as a way to save budget, save time. And so this is really a tool to help architects come to those meetings with the consultants, with the expertise, with, the knowledge that they haven't made a terrible decision around the massing that can be really hard to change later on. Like there are some things that have really big impacts, orientation, siding, relative form, and geometry that once there's a budget drafted up, it can be a really big uphill battle to make significant changes to that. And those decisions can have really big sustainability impacts. So the more information that earlier designers have, I think the better outcomes there are for the projects as they bring on the experts and have this as sort of like a starting working place.
Can you explain when an architect would use tools like Forma versus Insight?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Forma, as I mentioned, is really geared towards this conceptual level, massing, detail level phase of design. But we are definitely working on integrating that more with other tools such as Revit, such as Rhino, such as SketchUp, because we know that people have different tool sets that they like to use for different things. And so we really want to make this Forma part of an open, extensible platform. Insight, which maybe is a good time to move to the next slide, it's an add-in for Revit, which I know many architects use. And Insight for Revit is the only tool on the market, to my knowledge, that does both operational and embodied carbon analysis from a single model. So in many other tools, you have to do your energy analysis and your embodied carbon analysis in two different tools, and then actually go through the manual work of putting that information together. Insight for Revit is a single uniform place where you can customize metrics, factors, pull in the analysis information and configure it in a way that makes the most sense for your specific project. So if I just play this video, so what we're not seeing is typically a user would start in Revit and set up the model and then export the model to Insight, which will take you to a web browser. And within Insight, you can double click into the embodied carbon material definitions. And so here's where object by object or family type by family type, depending on how you set up the model, you can actually define the materials that you're using and their relative embodied carbon intensity as a result. And then right now we're seeing the custom dashboards being created. So there are things called metrics, which are, if you think of, say, in Excel, a formula that you set up to have your inputs that results in the outputs that you care about. In this case, it's PV coverage. And then factors, which are, think of them as hard coefficients. So for example, in this case, this is changing the percentage coverage of a roof with PV panels. And so these then are surfaced as cards, which you can drag and drop into this dashboard. You can change those individual factors and then see what that impact has on your project. So in this case, we're testing different density and coverage of PV panels on a roof and seeing what that does to the relative operational energy and operational carbon. And this is just one example of many potential workflows. The whole idea is that Insight is completely customizable so that whatever your goals may be, you can actually establish the dashboard that works the best to get that information and the insights that you need.
And the output looks like so detailed. How much more work is it to build up the project, or how much more information do I need to feed while designing the project compared to without using Insight?
Yeah, so with Revit, you can, with the Revit export to Insight, you can set what level of detail you have about the model. So there's conceptual level, schematic level, and detailed level. And if you do a conceptual level, you're basically just saying, I have a low insulation, cold climate wall type. That's just one example. If you use a schematic level of detail, this is like a specific setting you would set within Revit, you're getting more into the weeds of saying, okay, I have a specific U value of this number, and this is the type of construction that I have. And then finally, the most detailed level and requires the most amount of information to be actually modeled in the Revit program is the detailed level of construction. So that level is actually pulling from the physical elements within the Revit model. So however you have your walls set up with the layers of your gypsum, studs, insulation, facade, etc., all of that is getting directly pulled into Insight. So I guess the answer is it depends on what level of detail you have about the project. It can be fairly high level and more on the conceptual side, or if you have a lot of information and you know specifically the project will use XYZ manufacturer, you can also get to that level of detail. But it does take more work and modeling time to represent that.
So in the end, I would get kind of this report if I have the dashboards all set up. And do you also kind of showcase or give like reference values or metrics of what I should be aiming for?
Yeah, so that's not something that's shown in this demo, but actually just recently over the last year, the team released benchmarks as part of the functionality within Insight. And so just like you can set up custom factors and metrics, you can set up custom benchmarks, which then actually display as a dotted line on the bar graphs. So you can actually see how your project compares to those benchmarks, whatever they may be. You know, some people are pursuing AIA 2030, some people are pursuing science-based targets. People in different regions have very different requirements. And so instead of Autodesk prescribing a specific benchmark, we want to leave it open and flexible so that people all over the world can apply it to their specific needs.
I get it. That would give you like a huge responsibility if you would have to set the benchmarks.
Yeah, we try not to pick horses in the race.
That makes sense. So your role is about incubating those sustainability solutions at Autodesk. And what does that process look like? Like, how do you take an idea from concept to a real tool that architects can use?
It's an interesting process. I wouldn't say it's one size fits all. It kind of depends on different initiatives. So in many cases, I guess, me and my team bring our expertise from being practitioners in the industry and have an understanding of what the priorities are for the industry and our customers that are using Autodesk tools and what the gaps are in terms of our tool stack. And so there's a lot of bringing outside previous experience into informing what types of workflows we might want to incubate and experiment with. And then once we have that set as an idea, it's a lot of stakeholder and relationship building with people internally and also externally. We do a lot of work with partners such as Building Transparency or Habitable, which was previously Healthy Building Network, just to name a couple, in really trying to bring sustainability information into the BIM space and the tools that people are using. And so once we have partners and teams on board, they can get to work actually doing the development. And my team is often involved in the ongoing check-ins and updates and making sure the projects are still on track. It's a lot of project management. And then probably my favorite part is actually then getting the proof of concepts into the hands of customers to actually test out the workflows and provide feedback and really run these federated experiments where we're talking to customers and saying, okay, what did you like about this? What didn't you like? And then we use that for guiding future improvements and also as a way to think about what are the possibilities of using these workflows that we might not have imagined and we're seeing people are actually finding a use for. So it's a lot of creativity and discovery and relationships and like being organized also, just to keep things on track as well.
And who would some of your partners be? Like, without naming anyone, just like, what type of partners do you work with?
I would say there's probably a few big groups of partners. One would be sustainability data providers, so people that actually collate and structure sustainability data would be one type of partner that works really well with what we're trying to do, because I don't think Autodesk will ever want to get into the data creation and management world, because it's I think a lot of work to do correctly, and I think there are so many partners out there that do a way better job of that. So that's definitely one. There's also partners that are they themselves consult on top of Autodesk tools, and so a lot of times they're able to bring very specific requirements and needs to customers that have very specific needs that, like I mentioned, Autodesk could never possibly address every single region's and country's requirements around sustainability. And so a lot of work can be done by people who are working more regionally and localized to bring that type of capabilities into the hands of people using the tools. And then we might not necessarily call them partners, but I would consider customers to be a part of that, a group that we really love to work with. There's so many architects and engineering construction firms out there that are doing a lot of great work. And in many cases, some of them have developed their own technology tools because they needed something and they couldn't wait for someone else to build it, so they built it themselves. And so a lot of times we work with them trying to scale up that technology in a way that can be used by people outside of their specific firms.
If you're enjoying the show, I have a small favor to ask that would mean the world to me. By rating and sharing the podcast, you're helping us grow and spreading our mission of making sustainability really desirable and cool to a wider audience. Besides of that, imagine impressing your colleagues with the latest insights on sustainable architecture. So make sure you follow the podcast and become the most informed in the room. Thank you so much for your support. Talking about customers, you worked on an experiment with embodied carbon analysis in Revit, right?
Yeah.
What was the biggest surprise of your findings?
Yeah, so I can tee up the project a bit. So Autodesk is a member of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, which is a global organization that's focused on decarbonization, social equity, and biodiversity. And WBCSD has huge membership. Their members, I think, collectively contribute, I want to say, 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. I could be wrong. I'll double check that. But it's a huge impact just in terms of the relative scale of a lot of the businesses that are part of WBCSD. And a lot of those are architects, engineers, construction companies, real estate developers, specifically in the built environment group within WBCSD. And so through our partnership, there was an idea to really dig into the topic of whole life carbon and BIM. And what we were able to do was work with 6 members of the WBCSD. These are 6 architecture and engineering firms: Arup, AECOM, Ramble, Arcadis, Foster & Partners, and SOM. And we sort of convened all of these firms and had them do an embodied carbon analysis on the same Revit model called Snowden Towers, which is a sample model that we were able to use because there's no intellectual property associated with it. And put together lots of shared assumptions, try to design it so we could have a lot of guardrails around what the process would look like and see what the embodied carbon analysis results would be. And what we found is that actually there was a 34% variation in the results. So even though we all looked at the same project, we made several decisions as a cohort to align what type of materials and data sets were being used, we still saw 34% variation, which is wild because when you zoom out and think about all of the regulations and industry pressures around embodied carbon tracking, a lot of them are based on benchmarks or relative guidelines around the actual quantity of embodied carbon in a project. But what this means is without guidelines or transparency behind the processes that firms are using, we might not be able to actually compare a project apples to apples to another project because there's a lot of differences along the process, assumptions, interpretations that results in this type of variation. And so just to voice over this graphic, this is just looking at the structural elements within the Revit model. And we all used the RICS, which is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors out of the UK's framework for whole life carbon accounting. And so, this could be done with any reporting framework, but for the purposes of this proof of concept, we selected one single one so we could compare apples to apples. And each of the bars represents a different RICS category of elements. So for example, we have structural slabs for the upper floor and roof as one category, suspended slabs as another, foundations and piling as another. And we saw a lot of variation specifically in the vertical structure and some of the horizontal structure too. And so we published with the WBCSD and input from the cohort a white paper, which I'll just leave this up. This is a QR code to access that if anyone's interested in really diving into the results and the findings. And we've really unpacked with the cohort their specific workflows, what steps are they making judgment calls about the materials that they're assuming are in the project, which, some of those things are what we term design intelligence. That's really specific to an individual firm and a firm's sort of ethos of how they design a project. And that's something that we don't want to or think we should sort of flatten across the board. So there's always going to be some variation, but how can we reduce that variation so when we're thinking about implementation of global policies, we have a much better sense of the true impact of an individual project relative to the goals that we're all trying to achieve towards mitigating climate change.
It's kind of mind-blowing that even though it's the same project, there are same tools, there's such a huge discrepancy in the outcome.
Yeah, it's shocking to say the least. And full credit to the cohort, they were volunteering their time. They, I think themselves really wanted to be part of this project because they saw and see the value of what this work means. And without some sort of cross-company collaboration, I don't think this problem can be solved. And so we're actually starting the next phase of this project where we're going to dive in deeper into a portion of the project and propose guidelines for how do we actually narrow that variation and then apply those guidelines we've created to the project to see, can we narrow this gap meaningfully? And hopefully then that can be a tool and a resource that's used for practitioners who are trying to assess embodied carbon.
Yeah, also if we talk about greenwashing, there's so much greenwashing in architecture. And how can architects and developers truly measure and communicate sustainability without just ticking certification boxes?
Yeah, it's so true. And even beyond greenwashing, just having the data show the true impact, I think requires a lot of transparency and also sustainability literacy for people to actually interpret what those results mean. And also to the point about greenwashing, be able to know when something is greenwashing or have the critical eye to dig in deeper into any claims and assumptions that are made.
What are some of the biggest myths talking about greenwashing that you've heard that you think our industry gets totally wrong?
I know you had an episode earlier about timber not necessarily always being the most sustainable structural material because there's so many inputs that are required to, actually make that true. Thinking through the upstream management practices to how it's actually installed in a project. What are the other components that make that timber a viable piece of structure for a project? But I think the industry is learning that, there does need to be more attention and understanding again of the data behind all of these decisions. I think another one that I would probably put in a similar bucket is low carbon concrete, because of course concrete is a huge driver of global emissions and is a huge volume of it is used on architecture projects. But there are, I think, depending on the specifics of the specific supplier and the mix and the region and when it's being poured, all of these things are also inputs that need to be considered to actually, verify or validate that this material is more sustainable than, say, more typical concrete. So it's not saying that these things aren't ever more sustainable. I think it's just that there needs to be more transparency and information about a lot of those materials relative to what the typical construction methodology might be, which of course is a really complicated question, and people don't necessarily have the time to dig into the data and assumptions and research on that. And so I guess this is sort of going back to my earlier point, just the more we can make that information easily accessible and understandable by practitioners, then the better informed they are to actually make better decisions. I don't think anyone is maliciously using materials because they think it's worse, but it's just, we need to understand it better.
It's always easier to just, an architectural design always takes so much time. So we tend to take the easy decisions of, no, let's take timber because it's more sustainable without putting all the work on the research. If in this situation, it's really more sustainable. Now that brings me back to Forma. So maybe that would be more a question for Insight. So when I put in the materials that I'm going to use, do I need to say, it's like two questions packed in one. Mm-hmm. Do I need to say where the material is sourced, how it's delivered and all that? And the other question that I have is, when comparing, does the program make suggestions? Like mm-hmm. you would need much less material if you would build that in concrete rather than timber, let's say, for example. Or do I need to put in like the comparison?
Yeah, both great questions. So to answer your first one, I'm just going to pull up the material definition phase of the workflow. And so for Insight, the way that it works is it shows you what the embodied carbon factor is for the specific material. And there's a default library that comes out of the box. But you can also create your own custom numbers, which I think is actually not included in this. But say, you have a specific product with specific impact, you can put that into Insight as a customized factor and use that value in your analysis. One thing that I should really call out is that Insight focuses on the A1 to A3 scope of emissions. So for any listeners who aren't aware, that's really around the extraction, the processing, the basically like creation of the material from the raw ingredients for the building product. It does not at the moment include A4 and A5, which is the transportation and the construction emissions associated with that, getting that product to your project site. But this is definitely something that the team is thinking about and wants to address because transportation emissions can be significant and change, the decision-making process on whether or not to go with one particular material or another. Even though the majority of emissions do come from that A1 to A3 stages. So that's our starting point for now because we have to start somewhere. But eventually we do want to include things like the transportation emissions, which you can then take into account your specific location. And for now, even though it's not available out of the box, this could be something that a user could set up manually if they have the information around project distances and transportation method, like truck versus freight, ship, etc., which can be used as an input in the customized dashboard.
And maybe even like a value for recyclability or reusability or something like that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, like anything that has an analysis or equation related to a quantity from the Revit model or the sort of like physical characteristics of the Revit model can be something that you can sort of extract and pull into this customized dashboard.
But how could you include like recyclability or reusability?
Yeah, so this is something that the industry in general, I think, is tackling. There's different startups that are trying to create that value chain of actually taking materials from demo projects and bringing them back into the marketplace so that they can be reused and scaled for new construction. There's other groups that are assigning values, and there's also regulations in the EU around material passports and actually thinking about, say, this particular product has an associated passport, which means when it's used on a project, we can actually track how is it being used, what happens at the end of life, and it can be used as a way to inform, say, the next owner that wants to purchase that building. That passport gives them a lot of information about what is existing in the existing asset. And so I would say there's not a clear single bullet answer for what the definition for circularity in terms of a metric that can be used in an analysis like this is yet, but that's one of the really exciting things about the field is that there's always room to grow, and the field is ever expanding, and there's always things to unpack and like really hard questions to answer. And so I'm very confident that we'll get there one day, but we're not quite there yet.
But that's exciting to hear.
Yeah. And then I guess to answer your second question, the recommendations piece, I think this is something that we hear from people a lot is like, okay, so I have this information. What do I do with that? And I think that's something that we need to figure out. We as an Autodesk, how can we assist people in understanding the data that they have in a way that is then actionable? And I think a lot of that is training and enablement that might be with Autodesk or might be outside of Autodesk. I mentioned some partners that do a lot of consulting. There can be, I think, room in the market for people to provide that level of service to basically explain, when you have these criteria, these are the things to look out for when you're actually doing an analysis. And I think this also boils down to like architectural and engineering education. Like, what are the things that people are learning in school as they're training up to become practitioners? Like, I think fondly back on my environmental design courses that I took, and still, I think, use a lot of those insights and like paradigms of thinking in my work today. And so I think it's something that we, Autodesk, could start to address, but I think if we were the only ones doing it, it wouldn't be very successful. I think it needs to happen across multiple areas.
I agree. I have one last question for you, Sheena, and an important one.
Yeah.
How are you integrating AI into all of this? Is AI going to help us with the specific suggestions and all that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely could potentially. I think the topic of AI, especially as it relates to sustainability, is a really nuanced one. I think there's so many potential opportunities for how AI can help us solve our problems. Like, for example, I mentioned a few of the analyses within Forma that are AI powered. And what that means is we can save so much time on the typical analysis and actually spend a fraction of the time getting to a similar result and use that information to make better decisions about a project. But of course, there are things like, what do we do about the environmental impact of data centers and the compute time it takes to actually create the models? And so I think this is something that we're seeing across the industry. People are getting better and better data about, so that we can make better informed decisions about the pros and cons. And I think everyone's very excited about AI, but personally, I think we need to be cautious. It's like the analogy, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if we take the sort of paradigm of reduce, reuse, recycle, like, I feel like you can kind of think of that as a similar way with AI, which is like, reduce the use of AI for things that it really makes sense for. Don't use it to do calculations or, things that you can easily Google. But it can be a really powerful tool for doing things like predicting what the embodied carbon footprint of my project will be. So I think that's the first step. Basically, let's be really smart about how we're using AI. And then how do we, larger companies, actually go about sustainable design of data centers that really uses the energy efficiently, energy and water efficiently, in a way that we're implementing the best tools and technologies to reduce the environmental impact. And then finally, part of Autodesk impact strategy is around reducing our emissions. And then for those that we are not yet able to reduce, use really high quality carbon offsets to hit our net zero goals. And so, of course, you would never start with the offsets as your primary means of hitting sustainability goals. It's always about, being really smart about what you're using your tools for, not just AI, but in general, how to select the best thing for the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And I think the possibilities, we're like just beginning to uncover what those potentials could be. And I think we're seeing a lot of great use cases out there. And I think we're really excited to see what else we can do with the technology.
That's such a motivating ending to this conversation. Sheena, if our listeners want to follow your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, I think the best place would probably be LinkedIn. You can just find my name, Sheena Zhang, and I think I'm one of the few that are on there. Not too many of us in the world, to my knowledge. And then the white paper about the WBCSD project, I shared a QR code in the video, but I can also send that as a separate link, because I think if listeners really want to understand that project deeper, there's a lot of great insights in there.
I'll definitely link to the link in the description of the episode. Great. Thank you so much, Sheena. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much. It's been great.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials @LadinaShipf. Thanks.